Matthew's Gospel is one of 4 Gospels in the Christian New Testament. The text was probably originally written in Greek in the 80s CE in the city of Antioch in Roman Syria. The author presents Jesus of Nazareth as the Jewish Messiah, and the text is immersed in apocalyptic discourse. Apocalyptic Jews believed the world was currently under the control of evil cosmic forces, but that God would soon intervene in human history to overthrow these forces and establish a divine kingdom, what Matthew calls the kingdom of the heavens.
Most scholars date Matthew to around about 80 to 90 CE in the 1st century. And this has to do with a couple of factors. The first being that it was probably, or it seems to have been written after the Roman-Jewish War and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So the text of Matthew refers a few times to it seeming like these events have already taken place. On the other side of this window of dating is a couple of texts from the early 2nd century, such as the letters of Ignatius of Antioch and the Didache, appear to cite Matthew. So Matthew seems to have been written within this period.
Recent scholarship on Matthew has argued that the text is shaped by and responds to a series of crises faced by the author's community of believers in the late 1st century, especially Roman imperialism, and the power shifts in Judea as a consequence of the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 73 CE. To a defeated community on the margins of the empire, Matthew offers hope of God's ultimate triumph. Apocalypticism is a religious current and attitude to history found across many Jewish and Christian texts composed around the beginning of the Christian era. Its characteristic emphases are the imminent end of the world and despair about the conditions of the present. Apocalyptic thought is often essentially dualistic, with all of history divided into 2 ages: the current age, which is under the rule of evil cosmic powers, and the age to come, in which God will rule supreme. The text of Matthew assumes that humans are inevitably caught up in this cosmic struggle, and that individuals must side either with Jesus and God or with Satan. While Matthew exhibits apocalyptic characteristics, it is not generally classified by scholars as a literary apocalypse. Apocalyptic discourse is instead woven through the entirety of Matthew's text, and is not limited to sections where Jesus explicitly expounds his vision of end-time events.
The Gospel of Matthew has a really fierce emphasis on divine wrath and judgment at the end time, which is perhaps unmatched by any other New Testament text, except for perhaps the book of Revelation.
Of the 4 canonical Gospels, Mark and Matthew have a more pronounced apocalyptic outlook than Luke or John. Matthew in particular amplifies the apocalyptic imagery that is present in Mark. The theme of judgment saturates Matthew's discourse, and references to this final judgment recur frequently through the text. Versions of the ominous phrase, the weeping and gnashing of teeth, appear 6 times to vividly paint the mode of existence for evildoers in the age to come. Matthew's Jesus also frequently gestures towards Gehenna as the location of fiery torment for those who stumble and reject Jesus. Another major theme for Matthew is that the rule of God, the kingdom of heaven, is breaking into the world. The kingdom appears to refer to an actual kingdom ruled by God's anointed one, the Messiah, in which sovereignty, truth, peace, and justice will be restored. The theme is first encountered in the preaching of Jesus' forerunner, John the Baptist, who announces that divine judgment has come near and that those unprepared will be thrown into a great fire to burn. Integral to the preaching of John and Jesus is the command to their listeners to repent in light of the coming apocalyptic terror.
A hallmark of Matthew's apocalyptic structure is a dualism between heavenly kingdoms or empires and the kingdoms or empires of this world. Matthew uses a peculiar phrase, the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of the heavens, or perhaps more accurately, the dictatorship of the heavenly realm, to refer to this coming entity that...
The cosmic dualism between heavenly and earthly kingdoms is a hallmark of Matthew's apocalyptic substructure. There are several key points where apocalyptic imagery is particularly noticeable. A significant focus of Jesus' first major teaching block, the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, is entering into this heavenly kingdom. Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer, probably one of the most familiar passages from this gospel, invites the full coming of God's reign in the future, on earth as it is in heaven. Elsewhere in the sermon we find the well-known binarism uttered by Jesus between the few who enter through the narrow gate that leads to life and the many who enter through the wide gate and easy road that leads to destruction. Dualistic thinking is characteristic of Jewish apocalyptic discourse, as is the notion that the faithful will undergo various trials and tribulations before God's dramatic final intervention. Jesus' parables in chapter 13 also repeatedly allude to this future age and illustrate what life will be like in the kingdom. Drawing on agricultural and fishing imagery, the parables promise abundant harvest and reward, but also a decisive final judgment in which the good are separated from the bad. The most heightened apocalyptic imagery in Matthew is found in the extended eschatological discourse of chapters 24 and 25. Here, Matthew takes over much of the material from the so-called Little Apocalypse found in Mark 13, and supplements it with parables emphasizing watchfulness in preparation for the coming wrath in the transition to the new age. At the climax of Matthew's narrative, the events of Jesus' death and resurrection are laden with apocalyptic imagery that implies their cosmic significance. During Jesus' final moments on a Roman crucifix, Matthew suggests that darkness came over the whole land. At the exact moment of Jesus' death, the curtain of the Jerusalem temple is torn in half, and there is an earthquake in which rocks are split and tombs are opened. The imagery evokes the mention of earthquakes as one of the signs of the end. Matthew describes the bodies of dead saints coming back to life and roaming the holy city of Jerusalem in the days following Jesus' resurrection. On this passage, N.T. Wright reasons that some stories are so odd that they may just have happened. However, there are several social and historical factors that may have generated such ideas, given the often eccentric symbolism of apocalyptic discourse.
So what's the reason for Matthew's emphasis on apocalyptic and the end times and divine judgment? Well, some of it goes back to the historical Jesus himself, who most scholars think was an apocalyptic prophet of some kind. But Matthew himself seems to emphasize or really intensify some of the apocalyptic themes, as I've mentioned, divine judgment. It's when Jewish militiamen revolted against their Roman imperial overlords, only to be engaged in a protracted military campaign with Roman legions coming in, encircling the city of Jerusalem and destroying it, ransacking the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. And many Jews of the time would have understood these events as apocalyptic.
Scholars typically identify the devastating assertion of Roman power during the Jewish revolt, resulting in the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE, as a major influence on Matthew's apocalyptic outlook. During the revolt, Antioch, the likely place of the Gospel's composition, had been a staging ground for the Roman armies coming to invade Judea. The rise of revolutionary militias engaging in battle with Romans would have been regarded both at the time and in the decades following as electrifying events for many Jews. The revolt also had momentous implications for the shape of Jewish identity and society thereafter, and the events and their aftermath prompted much theological reflection on the immediate past, including the circumstances that led up to the capture of Jerusalem.
Antioch in Syria, a possible or perhaps even likely place for the Gospel's composition, was actually used as a staging ground for the Roman military early on in this conflict. So writing perhaps a decade or so later, you can imagine the author of Matthew and some of the early readers as interpreting the story about Jesus and end times in light of the conflict that they had witnessed and the military forces moving through their city a decade or so earlier.
Without the governing institution of the temple and a scattered and defeated population, formative Judaism was thrown into an identity crisis of sorts, with different groups among the scribal elite competing to define a new understanding of what would constitute authentic Jewish identity and practice from here on out. Ultimately, Matthew presents the theological resolution to the absence of a physical temple in the person of Jesus the Messiah and in the coming reign of God. Through this central motif, the text constructs a differentiated identity and societal vision that paves a way forward for Jews without the need for the temple. Whether or not we classify Matthew as resistance literature, the text nonetheless pronounces severe judgment on the existing social and political orders of its day. For its earliest readers, then, Matthew's apocalyptic promise of a new age ruled by God presumably provided at least some hope and encouragement for those who earnestly believed themselves to be living through the end of days. Yet, in the promised New World Order, existing socio-political arrangements remain. However, they are now under the control of a different Lord of Lords, namely God and his co-regent Jesus.